Hello, hello, beautiful listeners. Let's do this. I am really excited to be talking about practice, the art of practice, the discipline, the focus, the beauty of practicing over working towards, pushing towards, efforting our way towards achievement. Don't get me wrong. I like achieving. I like to celebrate the outcomes, the milestones. All of that is valid. However, I see that as the celebration of where you got to. But the thing to pay attention to, what will guide you on that path, is actually not the achievement alone, it's the practice. I love words. So I thought, well, how is practice defined as I was preparing for today's episode? And one, I love that practice is both a noun and a verb. I think that's great. And the noun of it is defined as habitual or customary performance operation, like an office practice, or alternatively, a habit or a custom. When you are verbing practice, when you're practicing something, um, you can have this be both with an object or without an object. So you can do it on its own, or you can practice towards something, like a regimen, a routine, a religion. Um, but the idea is, right, you're performing or following the habit. You're doing something habitually or as a practice. And all of this to say, some of the things that you see show up in all three of these definitions, whether the verb, the noun, the verb with an object, without an object, is it's habit, doing something on an ongoing basis. And that's where we spend our lives, right? The quote goes something along the lines of how we spend our hours is how we spend our days, is how we spend our lives. So if you focus on the fleeting outcomes, you're missing where we spend most of the time, which is also where we have the inflection to change the outcomes. So here's what we're going to do in today's episode. I am going to share with you source of inspiration I found from a recent stumbling across. It's actually not a recent New Yorker article, an oldie but a goodie from back in 2021. So I'll draw upon the wisdom of Ann Patchett and an article she wrote on how to practice. Then I want to share with you some of the mindset freedoms that I have observed in myself and also in my clients when it comes to operating with this mindset of practice over achievement. And then finally, I'm going to close things out with a few reflection questions for all of you, which, as always, will be in the show notes so you can let them wash over you as you listen to today's episode. And if you want to come back and roll up your sleeves and write it out, do it. You can always share that with me. I love to see what you're working on. Okay, so let's get into it and let's go to Ann Patchett. So this is from almost a little over 2 years ago. It was March 21. It was in the published New Yorker article. And this particular piece that she wrote on how to practice is really centered on letting go of things, actual objects. I will link to this in the show notes, this article. It's very worth reading, particularly for any of you who may be like me, sometimes feel overwhelmed by stuff. And she's going on, she's describing how to get rid of things. And kind of the headline subtitle of this article is, I wanted to get rid of my possessions because possessions stood between me and death. That's and in a way, practicing like this art of being in the habit and how do we move through our lives, like that's what that's what stands between us and death, like not just the releasing of objects, but the way that we're moving through the world. Like that's the practice. All these little achievements and celebrations and failures and missteps, all of those are fleeting little moments, but the fullness of our lives is made up by the practice. Anyway, and she's describing it as tied to stuff. Stuff stands between me and death. So she goes on in the article. She's describing how she's going through the process of letting go. And just to cut to like the moment I want to quote to you from this article, she has created space where she is putting all her stuff aside. And Marie Kondo would not approve of this. But she's then inviting people to come in and take her stuff. Marie Kondo would tell us now we're putting our burdens on other people. And Anne's onto that when she's reflecting. Here's what she says. So this is a moment in time that I'm pulling from this article where she has just had this young woman and her mother come by, and this young woman who's about to get married is, in the process of registering for things, is able to take all of these objects that Anne is ready to release, and that Carrie is just like, wow, they're so beautiful. And then how Anne, the writer, is feeling in the reflection of it and tying into practice. So here we go. This is just a couple of short paragraphs. So she said, as she's letting go of things, I went through the motions of reassurance without being especially reassuring. The truth was, I felt oddly sick, not because I was going to miss these things, but because somehow I was tricking her. So this is her reflecting on handing her things off to Carrie, is her name, this young woman. I was passing off my burden to an unsuspecting sprite, and in doing so was perpetuating the myths of adult life that I had so wholeheartedly embraced. As she and her mother tenderly wrapped up all those champagne flutes and dish towels, I pictured them tied to her backpack. When they were finished, I helped them carry their load out to the car. There they stood in the light of the late afternoon, thanking me and thanking me, saying they couldn't believe it. So many beautiful things. I had laid out my burden on the basement floor, and Carrie had borne it away, or at least a chunk of it. There was still so much of the house to sort. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to give more of the quotes, but what I want to say about this is, so you can feel her almost remorse, and the writer has been noticing that part of the reason she's accumulated all of these things, many of which she never used, is because that's what it means to be an adult. So she was in the practice of her life. she's she's like, well, to practice being adult, you have champagne flutes and you have china and you have all these objects. And what she noticed is, for her, at some point she realized, well, there are some things that she really does value, and that is about how she wants to move through her life. And there are some things that she doesn't, many things, in fact, and that's what she's releasing. Um, but she has some regret because here comes this unsuspecting sprite who's can currently carry all her belongings in a car, doesn't need any moving vans filled with boxes, uh, let alone a moving truck. So she has this remorse. The piece goes on. Don't feel bad, Carl said, Carl, her partner, as we watched them back out of the driveway. If we hadn't given it to her, she would have registered for it. I did feel bad, but not for very long. The feeling that came to take its place was lightness. This was the practice. I was starting to get rid of my possessions, at least the useless ones, because possessions stood between me and death. They didn't protect me from death, but they created a barrier in my understanding, like layers of bubble wrap, so that instead of thinking about what was coming and the beauty that was here now, I was thinking about the piles of shiny trinkets I'd accumulated. I had begun the journey of digging out. This was the practice, right? I love this. This was the practice. I was starting to get rid of my possessions, at least the useless ones. What I love about the way she's describing the practice is, it's in this case, what she is practicing is letting go of objects, letting go of stuff, which is always tied up in emotions and memories and identity and the shoulds and why didn't I, the regret. And if I broaden this out to practicing more generally, like the way that we move habitually, the way we perform in our lives, if we can release the excess and focus on what are the moves, the techniques I want to be honing in on, this is incredibly freeing. And instead of holding burdens of performing and what's the outcome, we can just step into like exhale. Being in the practice is enough. What I have with me right now is enough. And if I need to call in other resources to support me in what I want to be practicing, then I can do that. Like carve the path, release the excess, stay focused on what is it that I'm practicing. Now, ski season, I think it's officially over. I haven't put my skis away, but this has been as you have been tracking with me on talking through skiing this season. I've been in the practice of learning to ski. What did I need for that? I needed a mountain with snow. I needed skis and boots. I didn't need the poles, but they really helped. Uh, I needed clothing that kept me warm and dry so that I could focus in my body on being in this practice. Um, and I needed support to help me learn. Like I know I couldn't have done that practice on my own. I'm going to invite you in a moment to think through what's something you're practicing, and and what are the things that you want to need, that you need to move through this. And like Anne, as you think about the practice you're in, what can you release? Maybe what you're practicing is not death. I hope it's not. I hope what you're practicing is some form of life affirming action. Here I am in this body on this planet. And and as you're in that, what do you want to clutter clear to let you stay in the practice without any excess, and just appreciate that and see where it leads you? And what I can tell you from my own life experience, from coaching individuals towards their visions, from coaching teams on how they work together effectively to achieve wildly ambitious and delightful results, that if you focus on the practice, you're more likely to get there. If you beat a drum of outcome only, it's likely to feel exhausting and you're likely to get taken off track. This is why paying attention to the practice moves us to the outcomes more effectively than paying attention to the outcomes alone. Okay, let's talk about mindsets that create freedoms around practicing. So here's what happens for me when I am focused on practicing overachieving. And I've got here for you 5. Okay. First one, I have less pressure to perform. So when I'm focusing on practicing versus achieving, then I release this feeling of what happens if I forget my line? What happens if we lose? What, like there's an attachment in the outcome that when I'm practicing is released. And that's a gift. So the freedom of not worrying about the performance, I can just really release that pressure. The second freedom that comes to me when I'm focusing on practicing is that I invite in coaching. And yes, that can mean I'm inviting in coaching, like the kind of coaching I do, leadership coaching, executive coaching, but it can be all kinds of coaching. I'm inviting in input of how am I doing in this practice? And this is me specific. You might find when you practice you don't do that. But for me, it's so freeing because I'm not focusing on this is the zone of we're in it and like just do it. Like this is the moment of the performance. I want to know how can I get better? And I want to know what are you seeing that I might not see? And that coach could be my friend who's helping me skiing. That coach could be my sister who has really great insight into bullet journaling. that coach could be my husband who's observing me in action in my morning routines with the kids. Like there's all kinds of coaching inputs I can get, but I'm inviting it in. I'm very coachable when I'm focused on the practice, and that's freeing for me. The third thing is that I'm really appreciative of learning techniques. So, and I think this goes with less pressure to perform, open to the coaching, and really paying attention to what are the building blocks? Like, what are the techniques of the practice that I'm in? And you've heard me talk about that related to skiing. Okay, well, how are my edges turning? How am I smoothing out the backs of my skis? How am I staying parallel? Right, all these techniques. Where are my eyes focused? Um, just this week, I was traversing a wall doing rock climbing, which was new for me, and I was doing it with my kids. And I was like, oh, and I and I had there was no coach, who's trained in this there with me. It was though my husband was a great coach, my kids were great coaches seeing what I was doing. But what I found is there's all these techniques like how am I hanging on the wall? How can I move if I need to turn my body to dismount off the wall? Like how can I move one foot to the other, switch feet, and what's the technique for that? Anyway, so there's all these little things to do, and it's focusing on the technique. when I'm when I was relaunching this podcast, there was the technique of how am I recording? How am I how what are the techniques of how you can make your voice sound more intimate, less echoey. So all kinds of things that is really in the technique of it. That is a freedom that happens for me when I'm focused on the practice. And I think it's appropriate when it's game day, when it's the show is on, you have to focus on the performance of it. But if we can sit in the practice of it and not have a false expectation that every day is a performance, again, it frees us up to hone in on the craft and the technique. All right. The fourth thing that I wanted to celebrate around the freedoms I feel when I'm focusing on practicing is that when I'm practicing, I'm stretching my physical and mental boundaries. And there is this embodied and releasing of tension almost that happens where I get into what I think of as the practice zone. And here's an example of this. This is years ago. I had a really deep hot yoga practice. I was practicing hot yoga in a community in DC almost every day. And it was incredible. It was not Bikram yoga, it was hot yoga. Okay, so picture me in the room. When I started this practice, I was very novice. I had probably done a few drop-in free classes, Groupons back in that day, but I hadn't had any regular practice of going in person to do yoga. But I'd been now going for probably weeks, maybe months. And I remember learning things like, oh, now I get it when they say move with the breath. And I like learned how to breathe in this whole new way. I remember one day when I was suddenly saw how when they were saying to stretch back when I was doing downward facing dog, and I could actually extend my arms further and my shoulders shifted and I could breathe into it in this new way. And I was like, oh, this is the practice. And so I was in all these new distinctions, like little by little. And on this one particular moment, what I remember is I don't remember the position. It wasn't particularly complex. It might have even been downward facing dog, though I don't think it was. But I was in some position and I was so in it physically and mentally that I was neither thinking about it nor paying attention to exactly what I was doing. I was just in this like magical zone of being, unthinking, both mindful, but also mind released and in my body. So I was in a position that I'm not typically in. What I can tell you is when I became an awareness that I was in that, because in the moment I wasn't, is that I came crashing down on the floor in the middle of this room. It was a very packed community. Like you had to get there early if you wanted to be able to get a spot. A very committed group of people that would go. Um, and there were many classes. There was just like so many people coming in for this experience. Anyway, I came crashing down with, people right to my left and right to my left and right behind me and right in front of me. and and I was like, "Oh, what happened?" But the truth was I was so in it that I was almost like what it almost felt like I was asleep, but I wasn't. Like cuz I was just so just it like when you're asleep, you're breathing, your body's doing all kinds of things, your mind's not paying attention to it in that same way as when we're waking. But that's what it felt like. And that's what happens when I'm really in the zone of practicing. Like when I was going down those double black diamonds for the first time, because every time I've gone has felt still like one of the first times I've done it. And it wasn't every time I did it, but there were sometimes I could just say, okay, I'm doing it. And then I'm in the practice and I'm flowing down the mountain and I'm just pull, turn, and stand up, and pull, turn, and stand up, and pull, turn, and stand up. And I'm in the practice of waltzing my way down the mountain. Incredible. That's what happens when I'm stretching my physical and mental boundaries. There's a release. And then the fifth and final item I wanted to share around the freedoms I experience from practicing is that it's just this freedom of that this is ongoing and meditative. Like the fact that the practice is always there and available, that it's evergreen, allows me to almost see it as a touchstone. Like I can reach out for it anytime I need it. And that's an incredible gift. So those are the five freedoms I wanted to share that I feel and the things that come to my mind when I'm like, okay, when I'm practicing versus achieving, less pressure to perform, I can really invite in being coached. I can appreciate and embrace that I'm learning techniques, paying attention to the craft. I'm stretching my physical and mental boundaries. And it's in this beautiful, ongoing, meditative, sustainable way of being. Those are the freedoms I feel when I'm practicing. And it feels, I gotta say, really good. Feels really good. Okay, let's get you thinking about your practice. And I want to ask you just a few questions. And as I shared at the top, as you hear these questions come in, let them wash over you, see what shows up. And then the invitation is there. You can come back to these questions. They're in the show notes, they're there for you. Question one: what is something that you're practicing right now? So this is the question that gets you to hone in on, what do I want to pay attention to? What's the practice for me? And in that, let's just acknowledge that I'm naming for you, you're practicing many things all the time. But if you were to pick one, what's something that you really want to bring your attention to that you're practicing right now? What would it be? I can say for me right now, I'm really practicing boundary setting. And there's some cousins to boundary setting that are showing up for me, like saying no and also asking for help. So saying yes to help, saying no to overcommitting, recognizing that only I can set, uphold, and maintain my boundaries. Okay. What's something that you're practicing right now? Second question: what is the gift of your practice? What is the gift of your practice? So, for me, when I think about the practice of boundary setting, the gift of my practice is that it's giving me new ways to see how I've operated up until now. So, in the framing of the vision cycle that I move through around how to lead with vision, I'm looking back and asking myself, what are the boundaries I have set in the past or not? What examples of boundary setting have I experienced? How am I re-seeing my narrative up until now? And that's a real gift. It's helping me see with a totally fresh perspective. What is the gift of your practice? Third question: what gets in the way of your practice? What gets in the way of your practice? And just notice if as you hear this question, if there's judgment that shows up, like, "Oh, yeah, but all these things are getting in my way because I'm a bad person or I'm not good enough or why haven't I figured this out?" Just notice that. See if you can notice it without judgment or with less judgment. Cozy up to it. Say, "I see you there." Thing getting in the way or things getting in the way of my practice. What gets in the way of your practice? Like for me with boundary setting, a lack of spaciousness um, in my scheduled day, which really comes back to overcommitting, which comes back to saying yes without thinking, which comes back to a desire to please and a desire to do a lot, and how that can get in the way of my practice on being able to set and uphold and maintain boundaries. What gets in the way of your practice? Fourth question: is there anything that you want to release to deepen your practice? Is there anything that you want to release to deepen your practice? And for me, that this is a place of curiosity. I am currently curious about, are there big things that I'm holding, things that take up big chunks of time in my days, life, in my hours, which leads to the days, which leads to the life, right? Are there big things that I'm holding and spending time on that I actually need to let go of for the sake of what I really want, the impact I want to create, how I want to move through the world? And I believe that by getting curious about that and investigating it, it's going to give me space that allows me to be clear on my boundaries, which is, I'm noticing it's a learning thing for me right now. It takes time when every time I'm setting a boundary, I'm like, okay, and am I really clear? And do I understand it? And what would that mean in these scenarios? So there's this investment of learning and time and spaciousness for me to have it. And, and as I do really believe that being able to set boundaries is going to, and is already, and will continue as I'm in the practice of it, to transform my life. I recognize that there's probably some things to release that will both allow me to create space for that and will allow me space to be creating the things I feel called to create. Is there anything that you want to release to deepen your practice? And finally, what will support you as you practice? What will support you as you practice? Like for me right now with boundary setting, I can say that sharing when I feel it's appropriate, that how I'm thinking about the boundary. And that might be with my partner, it might be with a family member from my family of origin, might be with my therapist, might be in a journal with myself. Um, but being able to talk, like use the framework of, I'm setting a boundary. And am I clear on it? And how will I uphold it? And how can I maintain it so it sticks? That's something that's really supporting me right now. What will support you in your practice? And that, dear listeners, is what I wanted to share with you all today. As always, please know that if you are answering these questions, you want to share what you put down, I want to hear about it. By all means, please be in touch, share that with me. And if you are looking for ways to support this podcast and me, thank you. My recommendation is tell a friend. Think about what you've learned. Think about maybe there's someone in your life who would really benefit from getting clear on their own practice, from releasing the need to achieve. Send this on their way. Tell them not to solve a problem, but tell them from a place of love and support and understanding that that person is creative, resourceful, and whole. What made you want to share that with them? And that would be awesome. And of course, if you are looking for executive coaching, team facilitation, visioning support, be in touch. You can connect with me directly on the contact page over at pointroadstudios.com or via LinkedIn and Instagram at the Point Road Studios handles. I personally read and respond to every message and delight in getting to know you better. And until next Wednesday, please remember that there is nothing stopping you. So go on ahead and get after whatever it is that you really want.